Welcome to the NZIIA podcast. Here we talk all things international, from trade to geopolitics to diplomacy. The NZIIA seeks to encourage an understanding of the importance of global affairs to the political and economic well-being of New Zealand, as in this interconnected age, what happens beyond these shores affects us all at home.
Welcome to the NZIIA podcast. Today is part one of our two-part Ukraine special. Your hosts today are myself, Tanis, Heath, and Lachie Scott. Part one will contain a brief overview of the conflict so far, but primarily focus on the significance to New Zealand, the future of Europe, analysis of Russian military failure, the evolution and application of hybrid warfare, international reaction to Russia's invasion, and take a look for the possible future. In the second part of our two-part series, we will discuss Ukrainian history with a special guest. So let's start with part one, and let's go into New Zealand's reaction and why we should be involved or what we should be doing. We'll start off with the main question that arises whenever New Zealand gets involved in issues such as these is, we're so far removed from the conflict itself. Why should we do anything? But more importantly, what can we do? We're a small island trading nation in the Pacific up against a big superpower like Russia.
Yeah, it's like you say, it really is a twofold issue of why is it relevant to us and what can we actually do? But we can actually answer those questions fairly well, I think. If we go to the first point of why does it matter to us because we're so far away? Well, in today's globalized world, distance is becoming less and less relevant for one thing. You know, we can't count on the ocean nowadays to keep us away from the ripple effects and aftershocks of geopolitical events. But more than that, New Zealand has built its foreign policy since the end of the Second World War on what you could call the liberal international order, which is made up of institutions like the United Nations, the immutable nature of what we call international law. And for a country like Russia, which is rather powerful, to go ahead and flagrantly violate that, it jeopardizes the entire system that we have structured our politics in the international scene around. So for us to take a back seat and pretend it doesn't affect us is frankly wrong.
And to that point as well, it undermines our national security. Our national security is built on the basis of liberal international order and trade relations over having a traditional strong military force to defend ourselves. You know, it's living in a world where invading New Zealand is inconceivable to think rather than having a strong force to prevent that invasion from happening.
And New Zealand has such a good reputation overseas, in part through our participation in this order, and that has allowed us to forego traditional elements of national strength like a strong military. So for us to take a back seat and pretend it doesn't affect us and allow the system to erode would actually make our position a lot weaker on the international stage. We hold not the largest sway, certainly, but our voice matters currently in the system that we sit in, and it is definitely the best thing for us to do to work hard to preserve that. So what exactly can New Zealand do from here?
Well, New Zealand, what we've done so far is a series of sanctions. We've increased aid, increased our quotas for refugees. However, there is a specific type of refugee that we are accepting. And we've done travel ban and asset freezing for Russian oligarchs, members of the State Duma, which is the lower legislative branch of Russia, and targeted military individuals within Russia. Talking about what we have done so far, so we've already passed some sanctions. So we've now got a 35% import tax on all Russian goods that are entering the country. And so when you think of New Zealand and Russia, you wouldn't think a lot of trade. It is very comparatively small against our other trade partners. However, it is one of our largest importers of crude oil. As of 2021, some estimates put that around $250 million, yet some figures have that higher as well. We also have increased the refugee quota, but it is specific. Families of Ukrainian New Zealand citizens, that's estimated to include about 4,000 Ukrainians that can then enter the country and take refuge. But obviously that's on the basis that they would like to come to New Zealand first of all, and if they can, second of all. And we've also included a travel ban on individuals. There's a whole spreadsheet document on New Zealand government's website listing every single person that's on a travel ban. And at the top is Vladimir Putin, which is funny to see on a travel ban. So New Zealand also imposed a travel ban on 351 members out of the 450 members of the State Duma who identified areas in Ukraine that were being held by Russian separatists as independent. And this was the staging ground for then the targeted military operations that Russia would then go ahead with, which is the beginning of the war, essentially.
They say history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes, and I can't help thinking of the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, which was predicated on the exact same issue of breakaway regions north of Georgia, which Russia recognized as independent, and then moved in to apparently protect these citizens from the Georgians. However, that is not the full story.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I'm sure we'll come back to Georgia and especially Chechen later as well as comparing Russian military operations with those wars versus the war in Ukraine at the moment.
Before we get too carried away, if we could just jump back to the sanctions side of things for a second. One thing I found very interesting was for the first time New Zealand has had to create an autonomous sanctions regime. So for those of you who may not know, prior to 2022, any sanctions that New Zealand would want to impose on anyone would have to be approved through the United Nations. However, that becomes a problem when it is one of the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council that you are trying to sanction because they possess the power of veto. So New Zealand has had to take quite an unprecedented step to stand up and be counted when it comes to holding Russia accountable for its actions in Ukraine.
That is interesting. Is that the same overseas in other countries as well, or is it specific to New Zealand in that case?
I'm sure other countries already possess autonomous sanctions regimes. It depends on government to government, but this is the first time New Zealand has gone for it.
That's quite a precedent to set as well. So I guess what we'll do now is move on to what went wrong with the Russian invasion. Before the Ukrainian-Russian war, Russia built its international perception on its military capabilities. You wouldn't necessarily state that Russia was a great power. It hasn't really gotten to that level since the Cold War, but that is obviously up for debate. But they built that on the basis of having a strong military. You couldn't look at Russia and go, that's an economically strong country, or that country holds great sways in the region in terms of soft power, although that is growing. But they built their reputation on military. This has been like a disaster for that reputation.
No, that's absolutely right. So what was supposed to be a 3-day blitzkrieg-style special military operation to essentially get hold of our Ukrainian government, supposedly full of neo-Nazis according to Russian propaganda, and place in a new and Kremlin-friendly regime. What has instead happened is that we are now about 2 months into a protracted conflict where the Ukrainians show no sign of giving up, and the Russians have faced serious problems when it comes to their armor, their logistics, the morale of their troops, and the frankly horrific actions that the military has been committing against the Ukrainian population.
Off that, let's first start with one of the first things that has been identified as a major weakness of the Russian military, and that's actually been corruption within Russia. What is so bad to the point that I believe it was a Ukrainian defense minister wrote to Russia thanking them for their corruption in terms of strengthening their national security. And this extends through many facets of the Russian military. So one example that I've seen most recently is that Russian infantry armor has been comprised of cardboard. When Ukrainian soldiers have cut open the armor to see what's inside, that's also extended to the anti-missile armor that tanks have on the outside, the bags that they attach. Those were cut open at one point to find that they were just containing the cardboard that holds eggs. And so it's the idea that Russian military leaders and logistical commanders are spending the money on themselves rather than getting specialized equipment. And it is quite ironic because Russia, before the invasion, was touting off this new special armor that they had created that could withstand a 50 caliber bolt, yet they're sending their soldiers in, some of them, not all of them, obviously, with cardboard armor, essentially.
Yeah, it's a trend we've seen recently when Russia has unveiled new weapons like their Su-57 stealth fighter and has touted it as being the best in the world when, in fact, it has none that are actually deployed, none that are operational, and only about 4 that really exist. Similar problems with the T-14 tank. So a lot of people give the US stick for their military overspending and the problems that come from projects like their Joint Strike Fighter. And then they might point at Russia and how wonderful their new weapons are. But the fact of the matter is the press in the US is a little bit freer than that in Russia. So we are unable to see the problems that Russia has until we see them being tested in combat.
For example, and this goes down to even the most basic levels, is that there was this analysis looking at the tires that Russia was using on their vehicles, and they are Chinese made and imported. They are very cheap compared to the ones that the US has and NATO forces. In comparison, the tires that the US and NATO forces used are undergone serious testing before they're introduced, and some of them are even X-ray scanned to make sure that they are of top quality. Some of these Russian tires have just been faulty from the get-go, and others left under the exposure of the sun for too long have a tendency to pop and burst. And so when you see images of the 40-kilometer tank and truck line marching into Ukraine, a lot of those were being stalled not only by the fact that they didn't have any gas to get all the way to Kiev, but also because their tires were bursting under the sun and the constant pressure. Obviously not something that a strong military is comprised of.
There's a quote from Omar Bradley from the Second World War where he says that amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk logistics. The Russians clearly planned for a short operation and did not have the logistical capacity to support a sustained military campaign, as we have seen from Ukrainian farmers dragging tanks away with their tractors because the tanks have broken down and run out of fuel. Yes, you need soldiers to fire the bullets, but you also need a logistics corps to provide those bullets and to provide that fuel. And that seems to have been another thing that the Russians have lacked during this campaign.
It's also a different mindset and different strategy as well that the Russians employ. There was this paper talking about logistical strategy, push versus pull. And Russia utilizes a pull strategy of logistics, meaning that forces would have relied on historical requirements. And so they're predetermined by logistical leaders in that sense. In comparison, the West utilizes the pull strategy, which is more flexible and reflective of real-world data. So the Russian push strategy has been a historic failure and often attributed to one of the reasons why they lost the Afghan conflict back in the Cold War, was simply put, the predetermined logistics didn't match up with the real world data that was coming out, and there was an inability to be flexible on that. Obviously, it's much easier to manage going forward in an invasion, having predetermined logistics attributed to certain sectors, but you need to be able to reflect and be flexible upon that.
There's a lack of what you might call maneuverist doctrine and thinking on the ground, and that goes right down to the structure of how Russian units function, where they have an officer corps, but they lack a coherent non-commissioned officer corps, which is often called the backbone of a military, taking care of things like making sure equipment is up to date, filling in secondary leadership roles. And what has often been found, especially in a conscript-heavy force like Russia, is that when they lose their officers, the cohesion of the unit just breaks down. And we've seen plenty of surrendering Russians who have fallen victim to that very circumstance.
And that speaks to the general military culture that Russia has created over this lifespan. And an interesting note here is that there has been, I believe it's 7 Russian generals had died over this 2-month conflict. That's a historic number, especially in comparison with the US has lost 2 generals over its war on terror. One of those generals died in the Pentagon attacks on 9/11. So realistically, 1 general has died in their entire military operation on the war on terror. 7 Russian generals have died in 2 months. Now, the reason for this is these Russian generals are on the front lines and they're leading forces in a more personal manner. Russian state media likes to portray this as the fact that Russian leaders, they're fierce fighters, they're on the ground, they're with the men. But the reality is that they don't trust the troops to carry out specific orders, and they don't trust unit composition. And as you said before, Russia has a really large conscript force. In fact, 1/3 of its military are conscripts. It's also a manner of paying those conscripts and paying the soldiers. I did some research before, and conscripts get paid, I think it's 2,000 rubles a month, which equates to about 30 USD a month.
Wow.
And Russian enlisted soldiers get paid 500 USD a month. So obviously there's a massive disconnect with conscripts that don't want to be there, so arguably should have more incentives to be fighting, that are getting paid much less. And obviously that then feeds into the military culture. As you said before, as soon as those generals and officers start dropping, there is no leadership. A lot of those soldiers don't want to be there. Unit composition is destroyed and they flee.
And compounded by the fact that there have been reports that a lot of the Russian soldiers, and especially those conscripts, didn't know they were going to Ukraine and didn't know why they were in Ukraine. And that's not really a good way to achieve your objectives if your soldiers don't know why they're there and don't have the motivation. So to make up for the personnel shortcomings when it comes to a conscript-heavy army, the traditional Russian response has been to move its focus into an artillery-heavy military. What that means is that artillery becomes the main weapon of choice to achieve military outcomes, and artillery is very, very good at destroying things. And unfortunately, this is how Russia has won wars in the past. Putin won the Second Chechen War at the turn of the millennium by essentially leveling Chechnya's capital city, Grozny. He kept Assad in power in Syria by assisting Syrian government forces in bombarding Aleppo. And now that a 3-day special military operation has turned into the quagmire that it has, we are seeing a reversal to those tactics and the deliberate targeting of hospitals and power plants and other elements of civilian infrastructure. And that explains a lot of the horrific images we've seen coming out of Ukraine. The use of cluster munitions and thermobaric weapons in particular, which are very, very nasty.
It's a strategy that has been used in the past, like you said, with the Chechen War and also in Georgia, where it forces peace talks. You've got the Ukrainian military that has been doing an outstanding job in defending Ukraine, much better than anyone could have ever anticipated. Morale is increasing of the fact that they are doing so well. International perception has led to decrease in the ability in Russia's military and also like an increase in support for Ukraine. And it gets to the point where Putin probably wants this war to end soon. He thought it was only going to last 3 to 5 days. So how do you do that? Well, you indiscriminately bomb or you target civilians. You force the hand of Ukrainian leaders to accept peace deals because what's the alternative? Your country's going to be leveled, essentially. Before we talk about the next section, there was one other thing that I would like to discuss, and that's the Russian ERA system. In 2021, this was announced, and this was Russia's high-tech, secure crypto communication software. It was touted as being the most secure communication system in the world. However, this system has not been deployed at all with the Ukrainian invasion, and that's not a lack of ERA as a system, but again speaks to the incompetency and the lack of communication within the Russian military. So ERA relies on 3G and 4G networks to operate, and in the initial invasion of Ukraine, most to all 3 to 4G network towers were destroyed, basically resulting in your high-tech crypto communication system utterly useless. You can't use it. And so that has then resulted the Russian military to use civilian radios, smartphones, completely insecure forms of communication, and again has resulted in the lack of coordination that we've seen. There was at least one example of a Russian general being pinpointed his exact location because he was using not secure communication, and Ukrainian bombardments and artillery successfully killed him. There are other examples of civilians and anonymous and other internet groups essentially trolling Russian forces by playing American Yankee Danky and other patriotic songs just to jam out their communications.
Or even tuning into the very frequencies the Russians are trying to use to coordinate their military operations and essentially telling them, Vlad, go home.
So I think that all just speaks to most to all of the issues of the Russian force. You know, it's a failure of the military culture. It's a failure of technology. It's a result of corruption. It's a result of bad equipment. But for the next section, we'll be discussing the evolution of hybrid warfare, mostly talking about how this war was a lot more conventional than at least I thought it would have been. It is very much still boots on ground, infantry, tanks, and artillery. There have been some examples of cyber attacks, but not enough to kind of tout a major reaction to them. But the main thing has just been the success of disinformation. And this really comes in two parts. So there's the internal disinformation and narrative that Russia is peddling within Russia. And it's also the success of international disinformation and the international narrative that they've managed to construct. Talking about internally, Russia's always held a tight grip on the flow and narrative of information. There are very few independent news organizations within Russia that report with absolute, impunity. Most get shut down or flee the country. Quite a lot of these independent Russian news outlets don't even operate within Russia. They're on the outside. Some are in Ukraine or were in Ukraine. Others are in Georgia and so on. But it is the narrative that Russia has been peddling internally, is what you said before. They've managed to construct this idea that Ukraine has been taken over by neo-Nazis and that Russia is going in to save the Ukrainian people. It's also the idea that in 2004 to 2005, when Ukraine was going through the Orange Revolution and the Orange protests, discounting the rigged election, it's the idea that it's the US and it's the West that are constructing these protests. They're not actually the Ukrainians that believe this. It's the West and the manipulation that's going through. And so then this has really created an air of support for Putin. However, it is hard to see exactly the numbers on this. There was one report, one poll that came out by the Levada Center, which is an independent Russian news agency that reported Putin's approval rating to shooting up to about 83%. However, it is hard to see on the legitimacy of these reports for a number of factors, even one of them being that a lot of people will lie in these polling reports out of fear that they are not independent and that they are, in fact, officers of the state and that they will get in trouble for speaking their mind. And so with this notion that Russia is coming in and invading Ukraine to save them from a neo-Nazi regime, I'm sure you've seen some of the videos and the news reports going around Russia asking people on their support. And it's this disconnect from reality. And it's this idea that when they're questioned on the war crimes that are happening, it's this utter disbelief that they are happening. It's the idea that, no, we would never do that to our neighbors. We would never do that to our Ukrainian brothers. And that just speaks to the success of this narrative. However, it's not been completely successful. There has been a massive brain drain from within Russia. One economist has put the brain drain from about 200,000 people leaving Russia.
Wow.
So these are high-skilled, high-educated people not believing in the Russian narrative that are fleeing not only out of protest for the war, but out of fear for themselves. And so we'll speak to that a little bit later, more importantly, what New Zealand can do for that brain drain as well. However, these numbers aren't hard to pin down, but they do show that the narrative is failing a little bit within Russia. But perhaps what is more interesting is Russia's success in spreading the narrative and disinformation across the globe. They've managed to garner support from conservatives within the US and also far leftists. So within the conservative group within the States, you can see it in the way that Kitaka Kawasan speaks in some of his clips. It's that classic one, why should I care about what's happening in Ukraine? And more importantly, why shouldn't I root for Russia?
And that classic far-right pundit, I'm just asking questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, you see, I'm going to shamelessly parrot Professor Van Jackson from Victoria University of Wellington. Go check out his podcast, the Undiplomatic Podcast. But he refers to Putin as having deliberately built this global movement with himself as the leader. And he's seen as going after the woke West. You've seen the actual senators in the United States label their Democratic Party opponents as socialists who are obsessed with a woke they-them army. And it just shows how much Russia, however many degrees of separation you want to put in there, is at least in part influencing this internal conflict and spreading this disinformation, like you're saying, instead of allowing traditional opponents to unite against them.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because obviously Kitaka Kawasan doesn't have any legislative control, but it also speaks to the fact that senators are, questioning why should we support Ukraine. And it's that flow-on effect, right? If you've got one of the most influential, news presenters in America, Kitaka Kawasan, talking about this. That spreads to the electorate, that spreads to senators who then have an impact on how the US conducts its foreign policy to an extent, obviously.
And the US has been incredibly involved in this conflict ever since, or you could go back a long, long time, but let's go back to 2013 when the Maidan protests overthrew the pro-Russian President Yanukovych, and installed a government that was a lot more pro-West. And since then, you saw Putin annex Crimea from Ukraine, and you've seen what has essentially been a civil war in those two breakaway republics to the east, Donetsk and Luhansk. And since 2014, the US has been supplying the Ukrainians with high-tech weaponry and helping train soldiers to an extent. But what you've seen in reaction, and especially since the invasion started, is a reaction in certain parts of the political community that blame the US for this problem of Russia invading. And you see them having already come to the conclusion that the United States is a bad actor, and therefore anyone who opposes the United States must be good. And that is their logic for supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is quite flawed in many, many ways and denies the reality of what is happening on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. But it just speaks to the success of Russian disinformation. Russia has successfully peddled this idea that Putin is a strong leader that's rebirthing Russia. That's garnered support from hyper-conservatives within the West, but also by pointing out hypocrisies that how can the US claim to be a good actor, as you said, whilst touting their many war crimes. But the difference is obviously accountability. We know about those war crimes that the States has committed. There has been some degree of accountability. However, with Russia, there is that complete deniability that anything happened. Very few people believe that there will actually be any form of justice from that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, when it comes to online discourse, so many issues become binary. And so if you condemn Russia, it becomes, oh, so you support the US in its actions, or vice versa.
Exactly. But it's that idea that it just causes confusion and it draws attention. This is the whole point of disinformation, to control the discourse that's going on. And if you point out hypocrisies and other things, people will then pay attention, and then you'll talk about how can the States talk about, Russia's military intervention when it's doing the same kind of thing overseas. It distracts from the issue at hand. But for the next part, we will discuss the international reaction to the Russian invasion. We've talked a little bit about the significance of New Zealand and the tariffs that we've done. And we'll briefly discuss what the other interactions have been. Primarily, we'll look at the States, obviously sending in billions of dollars worth of weaponry, the Javelin missile launches, which has been the main thing that Ukrainian forces have been asking for. I think, as you were saying when we were talking the other day, that this is one of the first times that the Javelin missile has actually been used for its intended purpose.
It was used very briefly in the 2003 invasion of Iraq to take out what little was left of the Iraqi military. But since then, it's primarily been used in the war on terror to take out pockets of terrorists. Whereas now, like you say, we're seeing a full conventional war, and we're seeing just how devastating the Javelins and the in-laws from Britain and Sweden have been on what has traditionally been a symbol of military power, the tank, the armoured vehicle. And it raises a lot of questions for the future of operations. If you've got a missile that costs maximum $250,000 that can take out a piece of equipment that costs 10 times that much, you might have the advantage there.
Exactly right. And it then affects the cost balance of war. It then affects what technologies are preferred. As you were saying, if you've seen the success with Ukrainian guerrilla tactics in using these comparatively cheaper missiles against very expensive tanks, and seeing the success of that, you then kind of question that the future going forward, will military technology change? Will we see less tanks and less armored vehicles and more of an emphasis on, air and then ground forces?
Yeah, well, more questions than I can answer.
Yeah.
That's primarily been the US's role, has been arming Ukraine, along with Britain in particular. NATO itself, though, has taken a bit of a fence-sitting approach, which is completely understandable. They've long been hesitant to admit Ukraine into the alliance for fear of provoking Russia. However, they do not want to stand by and let Russia get away with what it's doing, so it's certainly increased its presence in Poland and in the Baltic states, and has strongly condemned Russia. But apart from that, there's not much NATO can do without significantly escalating the conflict. That is why there's been so much hesitancy in doing things like establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which, as you may remember, Zelensky had been requesting for a while, as well as sort of towing the line of the grey zone and potentially sending Polish MiG fighters to augment the Ukrainian Air Force. That hasn't happened again for those fears of escalation.
I'm sure we'll talk about it in the next episode when we talk about the history of Ukraine, especially comparing it to other states that are in similar situations like Finland was during the Cold War. But we'll talk about the reasons why there has been this hesitancy to accept Ukraine as a member of NATO, and why there has been, hesitancy for even Ukraine up to this point to even consider joining NATO. Like, it's quite historic that they have now gone forward with EU membership as well. It is that symbol that they're wanting to move more towards the West.
There was a debate recently, I think, between Senator Rand Paul and Secretary of State Antony Blinken, where Rand Paul was questioning the viability of NATO and its provocative nature towards Russia, and there's certainly quite a bit of argument there. But as Blinken rightly pointed out, Russia hasn't attacked any NATO members. It's attacked non-NATO members, Ukraine and slightly further back, Georgia, two countries which had indicated their willingness to join NATO. So it's quite plain to see that there must be many states who are quite relieved that they did join NATO in the wake of the Cold War, and you can see why Finland and Sweden, who have long been against joining NATO, popular opinion is now swinging the other way.
Exactly, because there was this idea that you could kind of remain neutral and therefore remain sovereign. But obviously, as we have seen, that is no longer the case for Ukraine. They have been neutral in that sense, but still more antagonistic in their policies than other countries like Finland have been. But obviously that has now resulted in an invasion.
So we've talked about the North Atlantic. What has the rest of the world's response been to the invasion?
Well, just a general wave of sanctions. It's historic just to see how many countries have jumped on board with this. I think it's
Switzerland.
Switzerland, yes. It's seen Switzerland's very first sanctions and strong stance against a war, who has maintained a strong history of neutrality, even in very ethical conundrums like this.
Yeah, if you're neutral during the Second World War but take a stance during this, that sends a pretty clear message.
Exactly right. I think it's a way of trying to strengthen the legitimacy of the liberal international order, as we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
If you have an actor like Russia that can declare war and act without repercussions, that sends a strong message that if you're a nuclear power, you can kind of get away with anything, Obviously, that has its limits, but it is Russia stress testing that. And it is very historic to see the wave of support for Ukraine that we've seen.
And there are many countries who will be watching this space very closely. I often get asked by friends who aren't as involved with international politics as I am whether China is going to invade Taiwan next, which I don't think is the case at all. But what's making them ask that, do you think?
I think it's just the idea that Russia and Ukraine have been, beefing for a while, and war is seen not as an option, but that's obviously changed. Watching this space, if Russia can get away with that without repercussions, then what kind of message does that send to other nuclear-powered states, like China and Taiwan? Could you get away with an invasion like that? Obviously, it's a little bit different. The US is far more involved with Taiwan than it is with Ukraine.
And there's some semantics at play where Ukraine is recognized as an international sovereign state by the global community. Taiwan is not necessarily. So China considers Taiwan to already be part of its territory, whereas up until recently, no one would have said the same about Ukraine being a part of Russia. And China is very, very big on things like sovereignty and territorial integrity. So it can't be seen to endorse an invasion of a sovereign country, even though ties between Russia and China have been growing over the past few years.
What's more interesting is looking at how the perception of Russian military has not been what we thought it was. Could that same logic be applied to other countries like China, who, to my recent memory, has not had a recent chance to flex its military might, just to test it in action?
Not since 1979.
Exactly right. So you've got this force that we perceive as growing substantially, having high-tech weaponry, but is it the same fallacy as the Russian military? Is it just projecting something that's not necessarily there?
It would be probably dangerous to assume that, but it's certainly a question that needs asking.
But don't want to find out in some cases.
Another interesting player in the global community has been India. So India has not jumped aboard the sanctions train that the rest of the global community has, and in fact has taken advantage of the embargoes on Russian fossil fuels to buy a lot from them cheaply, which at surface level would be very easy to condemn, and I'll try and refrain from taking a moral stance on it, but just break down the logic. And the fact of the matter is that India and Russia have had a very close relationship for probably the past 40 or 50 years now. And a lot of India's military is Russian equipment and dependent on Russian spare parts and Russian expertise to keep it functioning. Now, India has a very precarious border both with China and with Pakistan, and so cannot afford to anger the country that essentially maintains its military. So even though it has been trying to move away from dependence on Russian military tech over the past few years, it has had to do so slowly and carefully. And so one, as a result, can't sanction Russia for fear of repercussion in what is a precarious strategic situation. And then there is the simple matter of taking advantage of cheap oil, which is unfortunate, but you can see a cold logic there.
And I think that kind of just speaks to the overall importance of this conflict. A war with Russia and Ukraine has then knock-on effects for the relationship with India and China and Russia. You know, what was once a pretty tight love triangle, the US is trying to get itself involved in a little bit, obviously, try and become the military supplier of India, try be the partner for oil as well. It's quite interesting to look at historic examples as well. Obviously, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And it's interesting looking at the aftermath of the Chechen War, which the Chechen War was successful because of this decentralized military systems where it prioritized guerrilla warfare tactics and almost local insurgency groups to fight this greater Russian army. And there's a series of really amazing very short documentaries on the Ukrainian forces that were fighting with Russian insurgencies in the aftermath of 2014 and that 8-year-long conflict. And it was looking at how these independent fighters are fighting Russian insurgents groups, but they were also maintaining the strong independence. And although looking at it now, it's very interesting to see all of these groups fighting independently and fighting for the overall protection of Ukraine. However, it gets a little bit dark when the documentary crew start asking them questions of what if this war ends tomorrow? What will happen? And it's this large general consensus that we wouldn't give up our weapons, that we would want to maintain sovereignty of what we are doing. We want to maintain independence. And that also then speaks to what happened in the aftermath of the Chechen War, where in the aftermath, the country tried to become unified, but because of the decentralized and fragmented guerrilla tactics, it then ended in local warlords who didn't want to give up their power. Not saying that the same would happen for Ukraine, but it is an interesting example looking at how these independent fighters have got a really strong public support. They're seen as local heroes. And, you know, when questioned on whether they would join the Ukrainian military or surrender their weapons, it's an absolute no. Best case scenario for Ukraine, they win, Russia retreats. What then happens to all those regions that have been defended by these independent fighters and who no longer want to give up their weapons? It's a very interesting situation to look into. Yeah,
and it's hard comparing one country to another because of how different cultures can be in histories and things like geography. But a quote that I remember, I'm afraid I can't attribute it, but it came out of the United States prior to the invasion, was a threat that essentially if Russia were to invade, the United States would make its efforts to arm the Mujahideen in the 1980s. It would make those efforts look like nothing compared to what it would do for the Ukrainians, which was a very bold statement to make. And yet I couldn't help thinking, what happened when the Russians left Afghanistan? What happened to all those weapons that you gave them? And I think we all know the story.
Exactly right. And it's that idea that it might be good in the short term, but in the long term, it's a precarious situation to watch out for. Let's go the opposite. What if Russia wins and completely takes over Ukraine? What then happens to all the people? Is there a complete mass exodus of refugees? But more importantly, I want to focus on what happens if Zelensky lives. There's been recorded numerous assassination attempts that have all failed. And what happens if Zelensky leaves? and lives. You know, you've got this leader that Ukrainian people would aspire to, they would see as the rightful ruler.
A government in exile.
Government in exile, you know, and it really talks to Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, you know, you've got to eradicate the previous regime completely if you want to maintain control.
Yeah.
Otherwise, as soon as stuff starts looking bad for you, which was what happened in the Crimea. As soon as Russia took over, many locals were excited for the idea of almost a reunification of like a USSR system. However, when Russia started governing it, the economy for Crimea failed completely. It's a tourist attraction hotspot.
Yeah.
And what happens when Russia just annexed you? You're not going to get that many tourists come through. But it then speaks to the idea that if Zelensky lives and leaves, if the war ends with a Russian victory, will you then also have this never-ending insurgents kind of group sparking up? You know, will Eastern Europe then turn in the situation like the Middle East? You know, Russia is not a great state-building country. You know, is that still going to happen with Ukraine as well?
Well, I mean, we could go down many, many rabbit holes when it comes to prediction. I keep hearing there essentially being three options, at least from a grand strategic perspective, which is either Russia, like you say, wins and is either incorporated in or at least a pro-Kremlin government is put into Kiev, the repercussions of which on the population with things like mass exodus would be very interesting. Other option being that Russia withdraws, Ukraine becomes integrated into Western Europe, whether that's through defensive alliance like NATO or economically through the EU or both. Again, the repercussions of which would be interesting, considering how insecure Russia would feel after that, considering how insecure they've felt in the past few years with Ukraine slowly moving that way. The other one being that Ukraine remains some kind of neutral buffer zone, which sounds like a fantastic compromise and is unfortunately, from what I can understand, completely unrealistic. I certainly can't see the current Russian government accepting neutrality in Ukraine when the premise of their campaign has in part been that the Ukrainian nation does not exist. It is part of Russia. And the significance that Ukraine holds in Russian history, and it goes back to a point you were making about the Russians accusing Kiev of being run by Nazis, and that was appealing to a very specific kind of vitriolic nationalism where a lot of Russian legitimacy is based on its success in the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, where the Nazis came across Ukraine and the Russians pushed them back. And to appeal to that has been a very cynical way of igniting the fires and the passions, or at least attempting to, in the population. As we've seen, that hasn't quite turned out the way they hoped it would.
But it's just an interesting success to an extent of Russian disinformation and narrative. You know, it's the ability of knowing when to pump the patriotic pedal.
And it's when every lie or every good lie has a grain of truth. And there's been recent historic examples of those volunteer battalions during that 8-year civil war that we saw before the Russians invaded, or properly invaded, I should say. They've been in Ukraine for a while, those little green men in 2014. But unfortunately, there were certain volunteer battalions who were, for want of a better word, Nazis.
Yeah, and that's just like one of the core aspects of disinformation is you have a small grain of truth to give your big lie credibility.
Yeah.
And when people try to discount what you've heard as disinformation, you can then point to this grain of truth and go, how can I trust you if you've not acknowledged that this is actually true? Obviously, comparatively nothing compared to like what most of the independent fighters have been. It is still something that Russia can point to successfully and go, well, there's an example of neo-Nazis fighting us. Obviously, the big lie takes it to the next level.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think that will be us for today of what we've talked about now. The second part will be talking about Ukrainian history with Russia, especially the vulnerabilities that have come from that. Look into really the motives behind Russian invasion from a historic perspective. And yeah.
And the reason for such heavy Ukrainian resistance and the strength of the national spirit of Ukraine. Well, this has been a fascinating and interesting talk on the current happenings of the Russia-Ukraine war, not only what's happening on the ground there, but how it's been impacting the world and what we may see in the future. Be sure to join us next time where we dive into the history of the conflict, the specific histories and strategies of Ukraine and Russia, and some interesting insights from a special guest. Be sure to check out our social media. We are on Instagram at NZIIAYP. That's the NZIIA Youth Panel. And you can also find the remainder of our podcasts wherever you listen to your podcasts the most at the NZIIA Podcast. Thanks again.